On December 19th, 2025, Jake Paul lost to Anthony Joshua. Most fighters lose money, leverage, and negotiating power after a defeat like that. Instead, Jake Paul walked away richer than ever. Because Jake Paul wasn't just the fighter, he was also the promoter, the event organizer, and the business partner, and one of the people controlling where the money went. That's an arrangement almost nobody in boxing history has enjoyed, and once you understand how it works, Jake Paul's career starts to make a lot more sense. Jake Paul was born in Cleveland, Ohio, in January 1997. He started posting videos on Vine in 2013, moved to YouTube when Vine collapsed, and by 2017 had accumulated an audience large enough that Disney cast him in a series called Bizaardvark. Disney parted ways with him later that year, following a series of incidents involving his neighbors in the Los Angeles suburb of West Hollywood, where Paul had been filming content that included setting a furniture-filled empty swimming pool on fire in the backyard. The neighbors' complaints were documented in local news coverage. Paul's subscriber count kept growing regardless. The boxing career began in 2018 as content. Paul fought his brother Logan in a white-collar event that was produced and distributed as a YouTube video rather than a sanctioned bout. The audience was already there. The question was whether the audience would follow him into a format that required him to actually get hit. It turned out they would. By 2020, Paul had signed with a management team that included Nakisa Bidarian, a former executive with experience in sports strategy and commercial deal-making, who had previously worked in the NBA. Bidarian looked at Paul's audience metrics, his pay-per-view conversion rates from the early boxing events, and the broader landscape of combat sports media rights, and saw something that the established promotion companies had not yet acted on. A fighter whose promotional value came entirely from a pre-existing audience that no traditional boxing promoter could replicate or purchase. Most Valuable Promotions was incorporated in 2021. Jake Paul was listed as co-founder and fighter. Nakisa Bidarian was listed as co-founder and chief executive. The company was licensed as a boxing promoter, which meant it could legally build fight cards, sign fighters, negotiate venue contracts, secure broadcast rights, and control event presentation. It could also sign its co-founder to fight on those cards as the headline attraction. That dual role, promoter and headliner, was present in the company's structure from the first day of incorporation, and it has remained present in every significant event MVP has produced since. Jake Paul did not stumble into owning his own promotion company. He built it deliberately, and the structure he built it around is one that boxing's own regulations were specifically designed to prevent. MVP's early events demonstrated that the business model was viable before the company had produced anything approaching a mainstream boxing card. Paul fought Ben Askren in April 2021, knocking him out in the first round. He fought Tyron Woodley twice, winning by split decision in August 2021 and by 6-round knockout in the December rematch. He fought Anderson Silva in October 2022, winning by unanimous decision over 8 rounds. Each of those opponents shared a specific characteristic. They were recognizable names from combat sports whose best competitive years were documented history. Askren was a former MMA champion who had retired. Woodley was a former UFC welterweight champion in the latter stages of his career. Silva was 47 years old at the time of the fight and had not competed at elite level for several years. Paul's record was built against names his audience recognized from a previous era of combat sports, and the recognition was the point. A viewer did not need to follow boxing closely to understand that Anderson Silva had once been considered one of the best fighters on the planet. MVP also produced events that had nothing to do with Jake Paul. The Amanda Serrano versus Katie Taylor fight in April 2022 at Madison Square Garden was the first women's boxing match to headline the Garden, and it was described by DAZN and Reuters as the biggest women's fight of all time. That event gave MVP institutional credibility that Paul's personal fights could not have generated alone. It demonstrated that the company could promote genuine championship boxing at the highest level, and it gave Bidarian and Paul a legitimate answer to the criticism that MVP existed solely to manufacture wins for a YouTuber. The Serrano-Taylor trilogy became the foundation of MVP's claim to be a serious promotion company rather than a content vehicle. While those numbers were being reported and the Serrano-Taylor credibility was being established, MVP was simultaneously building a public argument that it represented something different from every other promotion company in combat sports. That argument rested on a specific claim about fighter pay. The claim is documented. So is what happened on May 9, 2025 in Orlando. The fighter pay argument was not subtle. Paul and Bidarian made it consistently and publicly across interviews, press conferences, and social media throughout 2023 and 2024. The UFC's standard pay structure, $12,000 to show up and $12,000 to win for entry-level fighters, with performance bonuses at the discretion of management, was the explicit contrast MVP positioned itself against. Bidarian described the model as one that left fighters financially vulnerable in ways that a sport generating billions in media rights revenue had no justification for producing. Paul went further, saying publicly that there was no NBA player who had a second job, and that professional fighters deserved the same baseline financial security as athletes in other major sports. MVP's Netflix MMA debut in May 2026 offered a $40,000 minimum base pay across the card, a figure Bidarian cited directly as the standard MVP intended to establish as normal. That public positioning was consistent with some of what MVP actually delivered. The Serrano-Taylor fights paid both women more than they had ever earned in boxing. The Netflix events generated purses at the top of the card that exceeded what comparable fighters were earning elsewhere. The fighter-first language was not entirely disconnected from the financial reality MVP created for the fighters it considered worth investing in. The distinction that the documents draw is between the fighters MVP considered worth investing in and the fighters who appeared on the undercards of its prospect development series, which operated under a different economic logic entirely. On May 9, 2025, an Argentinian boxer named Jonathan Gabriel Pachado fought on an MVP Prospects 12 card in Orlando, Florida. He was 28 years old, with a professional record of 6 wins and 1 loss going into the bout. He lost to Jeremy Adorno by first-round knockout. After the fight, Pachado posted on X that MVP had refused to pay him his full purse and had not provided him with a return flight to Argentina. He wrote that MVP had told him the state commission was responsible for paying his purse, a claim he described as contrary to standard industry practice, where the responsibility sits with the promoter. MVP executive Mike Linardi responded publicly that Pachado had missed weight by 13 pounds before the fight and had therefore forfeited a percentage of his purse to his opponent, per the terms of his contract, which would explain the reduced payment. Neither statement has been resolved in a public forum. Both are in the record. Pachado fought on the undercard. Paul fought in the main event. The gap between what those two fighters earned and who controlled both figures is not a coincidence of market forces. It is the structure of the business. Whether the Tyson fight was what MVP said it was is a question the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulations has not revisited since sanctioning it. What the TDLR's involvement actually means for a fight promoted by the same person fighting in it is a question the regulation was not written to answer. The Mike Tyson fight requires its own examination because it is the event that made the question about MVP most visible to the widest audience. The fight took place on November 15, 2024 at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas. Paul was 27 years old. Tyson was 58. The bout was sanctioned by the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulations as a professional heavyweight boxing match. It was broadcast live on Netflix, which had entered into a partnership with MVP to stream boxing events, and it peaked at 65 million concurrent streams, a figure Netflix described as a record for a live sporting event on the platform. The gate was $18.1 million, a record for a boxing event outside Las Vegas. Paul won by unanimous decision across 8 two-minute rounds. The judges scored it 80-72, 79-73, and 79-73 in Paul's favor. Within days of the fight, a public debate about its authenticity had reached mainstream sports media. Oscar de la Hoya, a former world champion with 2 decades of experience as a promoter himself, posted on social media that he believed the fight had been scripted and that Tyson had been held back. Joe Rogan, on the November 21st episode of his podcast, said he was happy Mike got the money and happy he didn't get hurt, framing those 2 outcomes as having been in tension in a way that implied the fight's competitive stakes were not what they appeared. Neither De La Hoya nor Rogan presented documented evidence for their positions. Both were offering opinions based on what they observed watching the fight. MVP's response was issued as a formal statement. It read, in part, that rigging a professional boxing match is a federal crime in the United States, that both fighters had performed to the best of their abilities with the goal of winning, and that there were absolutely no restrictions, contractual or otherwise, around either fighter. The statement noted that it would have been illogical for MVP to compromise a fight in the debut of what it described as a hopeful long-term partnership with the world's biggest streamer. Paul received $40 million. Tyson received $20 million. The Texas Department of Licensing and Regulations, which sanctioned the event, has not issued any public statement questioning the fight's integrity. What the TDLR sanctioned was a fight in which the promoter and the headline fighter were the same person. That arrangement is not illegal under Texas boxing regulations. It is not illegal under federal law. It sits in a regulatory space that the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act, passed in 2000, did not specifically address, because the scenario it describes did not exist when the law was written. The Ali Act prohibits promoters from holding financial interests in fighter management. It was written in 2000 with a specific kind of exploitation in mind, and the person it was written about was not also the headliner on every card their company promoted. That scenario did not exist yet. The Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act was passed because the history of boxing promotion contained a documented pattern of fighters being exploited by the people responsible for promoting them. Promoters controlled access to venues, broadcast deals, and ranked opponents. Fighters who refused to sign promotional contracts found themselves frozen out of title fights. The financial disclosures fighters were entitled to were routinely withheld. The Act addressed those specific abuses by limiting promotional contract lengths to 12 months, requiring financial disclosures before fights, and prohibiting promoters from holding financial interests in fighter management, the conflict of interest at the center of the exploitation pattern the law was designed to eliminate. The scenario the Act did not address was one in which the promoter was also the fighter. The law was written to protect fighters from promoters. It was not written to govern a situation in which those two roles were occupied by the same individual, because that situation had no significant precedent in professional boxing at the time of the Act's passage. A promoter who is also a fighter does not have a conflict of interest with themselves in the legal sense the Act describes. They have something structurally different. A single entity controlling both the commercial infrastructure of an event and the athletic performance at the center of it, with a financial stake in every component of the outcome. In September 2025, Jake Paul told reporters that the Muhammad Ali Act was very, very important, and that MVP had always been fighter first. His specific concern at the time was a proposal from TKO Group, the parent company of the UFC and WWE, to introduce what it called the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act, a revised version of the legislation that Paul argued would effectively import the UFC's promotional model into boxing and remove the fighter protections the original act had established. Paul's opposition to the TKO proposal was consistent with his public positioning as a fighter advocate. His argument was that the existing law existed for a reason and should be preserved. That statement is in the public record. So is the structure of every contract his company has ever offered him. In 2024, TKO Group settled an antitrust lawsuit filed by UFC fighters alleging wage suppression and anti-competitive conduct for $375 million. The lawsuit had argued that the UFC's exclusive promotional contract structure prevented fighters from accessing competing offers and suppressed their market value below what an open market would have produced. The settlement did not require TKO to admit wrongdoing. It did require the company to pay $375 million to a class of fighters whose careers had overlapped with the period covered by the lawsuit. The case established, through the settlement, if not through a judicial finding, that the structure of a promotion company's relationship with its fighters had measurable financial consequences for those fighters that extended beyond the terms of their individual contracts. MVP is not the UFC. Its event volume is smaller, its roster is narrower, and its contract structures are not public in the way that the UFC's contract disputes became public through the antitrust litigation. What MVP shares with the UFC is the fundamental dynamic that the antitrust case described. A promotion company that controls access to the events, the broadcast platform, the opponent selection, and the financial terms under which fighters compete. The difference is that in MVP's case, the person who controls all of those things also competes in the events under those terms and collects the largest individual purse on every card his company produces. The Netflix partnership that made the Tyson fight possible and the Joshua fight possible is central to understanding the economics of that arrangement. Netflix did not enter into a deal with Jake Paul the fighter. It entered into a deal with Most Valuable Promotions, the company Paul co-founded and co-owns, to broadcast boxing events on its platform. The financial terms of that deal have not been made public. What is documented is that Paul received $40 million for the Tyson fight and that the combined reported purse for the Joshua fight was $184 million. Those figures were generated by a broadcast deal that Paul's company negotiated with a platform that Paul's audience was a primary reason for approaching. The audience Paul had built over a decade of YouTube content was the asset that made the Netflix deal possible. The Netflix deal was the mechanism through which that audience was converted into fight purses. Paul was on both sides of that conversion, the asset and the beneficiary. in a way that no traditional boxing promoter and no traditional boxer had occupied simultaneously before. So the question is whether the existing framework governing boxing promotion is adequate for a structure in which the promotion company's primary commercial asset is also its headline fighter, and in which the person setting the financial terms for every fighter on the card is also the person collecting the largest check when the card is over. We have no answer from the TDLR's sanctioning of the Tyson fight. There is neither one from MVP's statement that rigging a boxing match is a federal crime, nor from Jake Paul's defense of the Muhammad Ali Act in September 2025, though that defense is the most precise statement of the problem available in the public record, because the law Paul described as very important is the same law that has no provision for the arrangement he operates inside. Every time Most Valuable Promotions puts on a show. So, the Take Him inquiry is about the gap between the regulatory framework boxing built over a century of documented exploitation and the new form of control that the creator economy made possible. A form of control in which the promotional infrastructure, the broadcast relationship, the audience, and the athletic performance all belong to the same person, and in which the financial consequences of that concentration flow in one direction with a consistency that the existing rules were not designed to examine. What changes that is not a question the documents answer. The documents only show what the current structure produces. The rest is a question for the institutions whose job it is to watch.